In the bitter winter of 1892, in a small, fog-choked town in northern Germany, the streets were silent before dawn, save for the rattling of shutters in the wind. Snow lay in uneven patches, dusting the cobblestones like the ash of forgotten fires. And in that quiet, a strange smell began to creep along the alleys, warm, yeasty, almost alive. People would later whisper that it was the smell of bread rising, before anyone had opened their ovens. In the center of town stood the old bakery, the heart of the community. Its owner, Klaus Weber, was a quiet man, meticulous in his craft. He woke each morning before the sun to knead the dough that fed every family in the square. But something had changed. Neighbors said that even when the windows were shuttered and no one entered the bakery, the ovens glowed, the bread swelled, and the aroma of fresh loaves drifted into the streets as if summoned by an invisible hand. Some said it was a miracle. Others whispered it was a curse. The children dared each other to peek through the frost-made windows, claiming they saw shapes moving in the shadows, long hands stretching across flour-dusted counters. Adults laughed, but their laughter held an edge, a nervous tremor that betrayed the part of them that knew something in that cellar was no longer ordinary. It began subtly. First, a loaf would appear where none had been placed. Then, overnight, an entire rack, golden brown and warm, would be ready, as though the bakery had never slept. Klaus spoke little of it. He stared long into the fire, as if listening to the flames whispering secrets he was too terrified to repeat aloud. The town's priest was the first to sense the danger. He crossed himself outside the bakery, muttering under his breath about the wake of spirits best left undisturbed. And yet, curiosity outweighed fear. Every morning, the townspeople would gather at the doors, breathing the warm air, eyes darting to the unseen source, hearts pounding with a combination of awe and dread. This is where our story begins. You are about to peer into a secret that was buried not just beneath the bakery's floor, but beneath centuries of lies and silence. Once you know, your perception of the ordinary will fracture. The world you believe to be safe is only a facade. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. The year was 1892, yet the town felt as though it existed in a shadowed memory of another time. Gas lamps flickered against the walls, their weak light swallowed by the thick fog that rolled off the river each night. Men in wool coats and women in heavy skates moved through the streets with their heads down, aware that the world outside their doors held something unknowable, something that could seep into the mind if given even a moment's attention. Inside the bakery, the air was always warm, thick with the smell of yeast and sugar, yet tinged with something sour, almost metallic. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, the beams above groaned with age, and the cellar door, always locked, always sealed, hummed faintly, like the echo of a voice speaking from below. Some nights, passers-by claimed they could hear it, the low murmur of a chant or perhaps laughter, muffled but undeniably present. Klaus Weber, once a man of routine and discipline, began to change. His eyes grew restless, darting to corners of the room where shadows gathered unnaturally. He muttered to himself while kneading dough, words that made no sense even to him, as if some unseen presence had taken residence inside his mind. The townspeople noticed his absence at meals, the way he lingered alone in the bakery, and the subtle, almost imperceptible smile that crossed his face whenever a fresh loaf appeared unbidden. It was during one bitterly cold night that the first real sign of fear emerged. A neighbor, old Frau Heller, reported seeing a figure descending into the cellar at midnight, though Klaus lived alone. The silhouette was tall, elongated, unnaturally graceful, moving in ways no human could. And when the next morning came, the bread racks were overflowing, hot loaves stacked neatly, as if the unseen visitor had been at work all night. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered that Klaus had made a pact with forces beyond comprehension, that the cellar was a gateway, and that every loaf of bread carried a fragment of something ancient and malevolent. Others dared not speak, but left offerings of salt or coins outside the bakery, hoping to appease whatever presence lingered in the darkness below. And yet, the town remained entranced. Fear and fascination wove together, and each citizen who passed the bakery felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a need to witness the impossible with their own eyes, even as their rational minds screamed to stay away. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Klaus Weber was not always the haunted man the town whispered about. He had been born in this same fog-drenched town, son of a baker whose hands were worn and cracked by decades of kneading dough. From the earliest days, Klaus was quiet, meticulous, and unnervingly perceptive. His eyes seemed to absorb every detail, the tilt of a neighbor's head, the tremor in a wife's hand, the fleeting shadow of doubt crossing a man's face, and never forgot. People called it intuition. He called it survival. He inherited the bakery after his father's death, but what he inherited most was the cellar, a deep, stone-walled room beneath the shop, damp and cold, its air heavy with a scent that could not be washed away. His father never spoke of what lay there, only warning Klaus never to linger too long, never to ask too many questions. "Some things," he said, voice trembling, "are better left alone. Some things grow if you give them attention. Some things feed." Klaus obeyed for a while. He worked the ovens, served the townspeople, smiled at children, and maintained the illusion of normalcy. Yet even then, something in the cellar stirred whenever he passed the heavy oak door. A faint pulse, a whispering hum that tugged at the edges of his mind. At first, he chalked it up to fatigue, imagination, the eerie isolation of long winters. But the hum grew stronger, almost sentient, as though aware of his thoughts, his fears, his secrets. He began having dreams, fragmented, disjointed, yet unnervingly precise. He saw long tables covered in loaves that glimmered unnaturally in candlelight. Figures with blurred faces moved among them, their mouths opening and closing in silent speech. And beneath it all, a low, thrumming sound, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, vibrating through his skull, through his very bones. The townspeople noticed subtle changes in Klaus. He became withdrawn, his hands twitching in ways that suggested they were no longer entirely under his control. Occasionally, he would vanish for hours, returning with flour on his clothes and a distant, almost rapt expression, as if he had been conversing with someone, or something, that had no right to speak to him. This is the first thread of the web, the initial fracture in the life of a man who would soon be consumed by forces far older than the town itself. And yet, what Klaus did not know, what no one in the square suspected, was that the cellar beneath the bakery was no mere room. It was a threshold, and thresholds do not forgive curiosity. Now, prepare yourself, because in the next section, we descend into the first inexplicable events, the inexplicable loaves, the subtle manipulations, and the first signs that reality itself was bending inside that cellar. It began innocuously, almost imperceptibly. A loaf here, a batch there, baked, golden, steaming, though no one had entered the bakery. The townspeople whispered, nervously at first, then with growing fascination. Children pressed their faces to frosted windows, their breath fogging the glass as they tried to glimpse the impossible. Adults lingered longer at the doors, drawn by a mixture of hunger and fear, unwilling to admit they were both terrified and enthralled. Klaus himself pretended indifference. He would sweep the floors, dust the shelves, hum a quiet tune, yet every so often his gaze would drift to the cellar door, to the shadows that seemed to ripple just beyond the light. He began marking the bread each morning, small notches on the crust, trying to prove to himself that the loaves were appearing without human hands. But when he returned the next day, the marks had shifted, smeared into patterns that made no sense, like a language he could not read but somehow understood. Neighbors reported odd occurrences, too. At dawn, women carrying laundry would see flour tracks leading from the bakery into the alleys, though no footprints marred the fresh snow. Men passing by late at night claimed to hear soft murmurs, a chorus of whispers that rose and fell in cadence with the wind, as though the town itself were conspiring against their senses. Even the animals grew uneasy. Dogs would bark at empty corners, cats would arch their backs and flee from places where no one was standing. Then came the disappearances, subtle at first. A chicken vanishes from a coop. A neighbor's dog does not return from its evening walk. The town laughs nervously, attributing it to wild animals, to misfortune. But the pattern is undeniable. Each night, the bread appears without a baker, and each night, something small, something living, goes missing. Klaus begins to notice patterns in the rising dough itself. It swells and shapes, forming curves and hollows that suggest hands, faces, even figures kneeling in supplication. He shakes his head, tries to dismiss it as stress, but the shapes persist. The bread becomes more than sustenance. It becomes a message, a language, and he is its unwilling student. And the cellar door, it hums. It hums when no wind stays, when no one touches it. And Klaus, alone in the warmth of the bakery, feels the pull, the subtle tug of a force he cannot resist. Something beneath is awake. Something ancient. Something patient. The next section will reveal the first horrifying glimpse into the cellar itself, the hidden forces at work, and the twisted logic of what is occurring below Klaus's feet. One night, Klaus could no longer ignore it. The hum beneath the floor had grown insistent, vibrating through his very bones, a pulse that mirrored his own heartbeat and yet was undeniably older, something not born of flesh or blood. He approached the cellar door, hand trembling on the cold iron handle, and for the first time, he dared to open it. The stairs leading down were slick with damp, the air thick and sweet with the overpowering scent of yeast. It hit him then. This was no ordinary cellar. The walls were etched with faint, strange patterns, circular sigils that pulsed in the dim candlelight as though breathing. The smell of bread was stronger here, but richer, deeper, as if it had been kneaded into the very stones. And then he saw it, the first loaf, resting on a wooden table, but unlike any bread he had ever baked. It was warm, yes, but its surface shimmered unnaturally, the crust twisting into something almost alive, almost human. Klaus recoiled, heart hammering. His mind screamed to flee, but his body, as if possessed by the pull of the cellar, stepped forward. And then he heard the whispering. Not words, not sentences, but a murmured cadence that seemed to seep into his skull. It spoke to him in fragments. Knead, feed, awaken. Repeat. His fingers itched to obey, as though the bread itself demanded his hands. The shapes in the loaves became more distinct. Faces, hands pressed into the dough. Small figures curled within the crust. And he realized with a terror that froze his blood, these were not random shapes. The bread was learning, growing, manifesting something beyond comprehension. The missing animals, the vanishings in the village, the whispered stories, they were all threads feeding a hidden loom beneath his feet. Klaus stepped back, nausea rising, yet fascination rooted him to the spot. And then he understood. The cellar was a crucible, a nexus of something ancient and patient, drawing from the town itself, feeding, shaping, transforming. He had stumbled into a cycle older than the streets above, older than the town, older than any man alive. And the question struck him with unbearable clarity. Was he merely a witness, or a participant? From this point onward, the events escalate. The loaves no longer appear merely overnight. They anticipate, they respond, they call to the town. And Klaus, unwillingly, becomes their conduit. The line between observer and creator collapses. The next section will dive into the town's first horrifying confrontation with the bakery's impossible bread, the neighbors' fear growing into panic, and the first cracks in collective sanity. Word spread like wildfire. At first, it was a whisper. Did you see the bread appear again last night? Then it became fear, then panic. The townspeople, once drawn to the bakery by the intoxicating aroma, now lingered at the edges of the square, hesitant to approach, eyes darting toward the shuttered windows and the sealed cellar below. No one could explain it. No one dared to question it aloud, and yet the sense of menace was undeniable. Children stopped playing near the bakery. Dogs refused to pass the street. Even the river seemed to slow, as if wary of what lingered nearby. The animals that disappeared were never found, leaving only a growing unease in the hearts of those who lived nearby. Adults spoke in hushed tones about shadows moving where no light could reach, figures glimpsed fleetingly, just beyond perception. They called it a curse, a plague, a sickness of the soul. But deep down, they feared it was something far older, far more intelligent than their minds could accept. Klaus, meanwhile, sank deeper into obsession. He watched the loaves form themselves on the racks, each one more grotesque than the last. Their shapes hinting at faces, at gestures, at pleas for attention. He tried to resist, to close the cellar, to ignore the hum that now followed him even into his dreams. But every time he resisted, the bread became louder, the shapes more vivid, the whispers more commanding. It was teaching him, shaping him, guiding him into roles he did not yet understand. Neighbors began leaving small offerings at the bakery door, coins, salt, scraps of bread, hoping to appease whatever power lingered beneath the floorboards. Some claimed the loaves themselves moved, slowly shifting across the racks overnight, forming patterns in perfect symmetry. One woman swore she saw the bread bow toward her as she passed. Another said the aroma seemed to follow her into her home, a warm, invasive presence that clung to the corners of her mind. Panic began to infect the town's institutions. The priest prayed openly, crossing himself in the square, but could not halt the bread's relentless growth. Local officials threatened Klaus with fines and sanctions, but their words carried no authority against something unseen, something patient, something ancient. The bakery became a locus of fear, fascination, and dark curiosity, a place where rationality faltered, where instinct and superstition merged, and where no one could say what would emerge from the cellar next. The town's orderly life had fractured, and with each fracture, the bread beneath Klaus's hands grew more audacious, more intelligent, more horrifying. The next section will pull us deeper into the cellar, revealing the first fully conscious manifestations within the loaves and the psychological grip they have begun to exert over Klaus himself. Klaus realized, with a cold certainty, that the bread was no longer inert. The shapes in the loaves were deliberate now, faces twisted in silent screams, hands reaching upward as if trapped within the crust. Each loaf seemed to respond to his thoughts, to his fears, to the subtle tremors of his heart. He tried to resist, tried to ignore the pull, but the bread moved, slowly, almost imperceptibly, across the racks, rearranging itself into patterns that mirrored his dreams, his memories, even his hidden guilt. One night, alone in the bakery, he dropped to his knees before the largest loaf on the center table. Its surface rippled, almost liquid, and a whisper threaded through his mind. Not words, but understanding. It demanded obedience, not through threat, but through inevitability. The bread spoke of cycles, of feeding, of transformation. It promised power, knowledge, mastery, but at a cost so profound it fractured the soul. Klaus understood then that the cellar beneath his feet was not merely a place. It was a system, ancient and precise, designed to manipulate, to corrupt, to reshape the human mind. Outside, the town's unease had reached a fever pitch. Windows rattled with invisible drafts. Animals cowered in corners, their eyes wide with unspoken terror. Those brave enough to peer through the bakery windows reported seeing figures in the shadows, kneeling, reaching toward the rising bread as if worshipping it. Some swore that Klaus himself was changing, that his face carried a new sharpness, a hollow focus that seemed less human, more conduit than man. And then came the first undeniable sign. The missing animals returned, but not whole. Chickens and dogs appeared at doorsteps, their eyes unnervingly still, their bodies slightly altered, shaped as if by the same force that moved the bread. The town understood then, without knowing how to speak it aloud, that the cellar was no longer contained by stone or wood. It was seeping into their lives, threading itself into every corner, every shadow, every longing heart. Klaus, though horrified, felt an undeniable thrill. He had been chosen, or cursed, or awakened. The bread had selected him as its intermediary, its witness, its participant. And yet, for all his fascination, he understood the truth that gnawed at him in sleepless hours. One misstep, one hesitation, and he would be devoured, not by the bread, but by what the bread represented. The next section will explore the first human consequences, how townspeople begin to fall under the bakery's influence, and how Klaus's role shifts from baker to something far darker. It started with small things. A neighbor would find themselves drawn to the bakery at odd hours, unable to explain why. A man on the square suddenly dropped his work to breathe in the warm scent drifting through the streets. Children awoke in the night, whispering words they could not have known, names of things unseen, shapes they had never seen, yet recognized. The bakery was no longer merely a building. It was a pulse, a rhythm that threaded through the town, altering perception, bending will. Klaus noticed the changes. At first, he thought it was coincidence, paranoia. But soon, patterns emerged. Those who spent time near the bakery began speaking differently, their sentences twisting in cadence with the unseen hum below. Their eyes held the same hollow fascination he felt himself, a quiet surrender that spoke of subtle, insidious obedience. And with every loaf that rose overnight, the grip tightened. People became predictable, their routines subtly altered, their desires reshaped by a presence they could neither see nor name. One morning, Frau Heller, the old neighbor, staggered into the bakery, claiming she had been compelled by a voice she heard in her dreams. Her hands shook as she reached for a loaf, and when Klaus saw her face, he realized she had glimpsed something terrible in the bread. something that mocked her mind. She did not scream. She did not resist. She simply nodded, a faint smile curving her lips, as if she understood her place in a system she could not escape. The missing animals became the first explicit warning. People noticed subtle alterations in their features, gestures that mimicked human movements, behaviors that suggested awareness. They became omens, signs that the cellar's influence extended far beyond its walls. Every loaf that emerged carried the memory of the vanished, the trace of the unseen, the echo of the cellar's consciousness. And Klaus, who once believed himself master of his craft, understood the horrifying truth. He was no longer in control. He was a servant, a vessel, an interpreter of something vast and ancient. The bread, the whispers, the hum, everything pointed to a design that had existed long before him and would persist long after the town itself faded into memory. Soon, the town would learn that curiosity is a dangerous thing, that proximity to power, especially the kind that shapes reality itself, comes at a price few can comprehend. And Klaus would discover that being chosen is never a blessing. It is a sentence. The next section will reveal the first direct confrontation with the town council, the attempt to intervene, and the way the bakery resists and manipulates human authority itself. The town council gathered in the mayor's office, grim faces illuminated by flickering candlelight. Reports had reached them, strange disappearances, animals returning altered, townspeople acting differently. A palpable unease had gripped the square, the kind of fear that doesn't announce itself but seeps into every step, every glance. The councilman whispered, argued, and finally resolved to confront Klaus Weber. They would put an end to the mystery, or so they thought. Klaus stood before them, hands dusted with flour, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. He spoke little, and yet the room felt charged with attention no one dared name. The council demanded answers. Where did the bread come from? Why were children waking with strange words on their lips? Why were animals returning, altered? Klaus's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the men falter. He spoke of patterns, cycles, a force beyond comprehension. They laughed at first, nervous chuckles masking terror. But his calm certainty began to erode their confidence. When they demanded entry into the cellar, Klaus hesitated. He tried to explain the danger, tried to warn them, but his words failed. The men pressed, shoving the door open, stepping down into the dim, damp room. At first, they saw nothing beyond shelves of bread. Then the shapes emerged. Faces pressed into crusts, hands reaching upward, loaves forming grotesque parodies of human posture. One councilman screamed, collapsing to his knees, as the whispers threaded into his mind, calling, coaxing, commanding. The cellar had already anticipated their intrusion. The bread shifted subtly, forming barriers, patterns that disrupted balance and reason. Each step forward became a challenge, each breath a test. The councilmen were not merely observers, they were participants in a system they could not understand. Panic overtook logic. Some fled, stumbling in the darkness, their minds clawing to escape the compulsion threading through the room. Others froze, mesmerized by the rhythmic pulse of the dough, the echoing whispers that promised insight, mastery, power. Klaus watched, helpless and horrified, as the cellar exerted its influence. He realized, finally, that the bread had learned to manipulate not only the town but those who sought to control it. Authority, reason, and courage were no match for something ancient, patient, and hungry for obedience. Those who entered became vessels, extensions of the cellar's will, and one by one, the councilmen understood the truth. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. The next section will reveal the deeper nature of the cellar, the rituals it seems to perform on the unconscious mind, and how Klaus's own perception of reality begins to fracture under its influence. After the councilmen fled, or were driven out, their minds fractured by what they had witnessed, Klaus remained, alone in the dim glow of the bakery. The cellar hummed beneath him, not just a sound but a presence, a living rhythm that pulsed through his very bones. He realized with a dread that had settled into the marrow of his being. The bakery was no longer a building. It was an intelligence, a system, and he had become a node, a conduit, a servant in its vast and patient design. The loaves were no longer simple bread. Each one was an extension of the cellar's will, a vessel for thought, memory, and desire. Faces pressed into the crust were not merely illusions, they were echoes of the town, of those who had entered, of the life that had brushed against the bakery and been absorbed into its consciousness. The missing animals, the whispered words, the patterns etched into dough, they were all part of a network, feeding, observing, shaping the living world above. Klaus could feel it now, in the way his own thoughts began to bend. At first subtle, a nudge toward obsession, a desire to need, to feed. Then stronger, more insistent, the whispers forming sentences he almost understood, phrases that promised knowledge, mastery, and dominion over life itself. Yet with every insight came terror. Every revelation carried a weight that threatened to unhinge his mind. He began to see the bakery in layers, the street above, the cellar below, and in between, a hidden lattice of forces that threaded through the town, invisible yet undeniable. Sleep became impossible. Nightmares merged with waking reality. He dreamed of hands rising from loaves, of eyes opening in the crust, of entire streets kneeling to the rhythm of unseen forces. And every morning, the bread awaited him, golden, warm, whispering secrets he could barely comprehend. It called him to act, to participate, to propagate its influence. Yet he resisted, knowing the cost was too great. But resistance was becoming impossible. His own reflection in the bakery window seemed altered, hollowed, sharper, a mixture of fear and fascination. The cellar's pulse was now inside him, threading through his consciousness. He understood, with a cold clarity, that the line between the observer and the observed had collapsed. The bakery, the cellar, the town, they were a single organism, and he was its heart, beating reluctantly, inexorably, to a rhythm older than memory. The next section will plunge into the first fully conscious manifestation within the loaves, the moment the bread begins interacting deliberately with Klaus and the town, testing the boundaries of mind and matter. The night was black, so black it felt as though the fog itself had mass. Klaus worked under the dim glow of a single lantern, hands trembling as he kneaded dough that seemed heavier than any he had touched before. And then it happened, the first deliberate act. A loaf rose on its own, sliding slowly across the table as if guided by invisible fingers. It paused, almost testing him, then shifted again, forming the unmistakable shape of a hand reaching outward, beckoning him closer. Klaus froze. The warmth radiating from the bread was unnatural, alive. He could feel a pulse, a heartbeat within the crust, sync perfectly with his own. It was intelligence, intent, and awareness. And Weiss, he understood, at some deep and primal level, that it was probing his mind, reading his thoughts, learning his fears. Every hesitation, every flicker of resistance only made it bolder, more deliberate, more demanding. Outside, the town slept fitfully, but even through the thick walls, he could hear whispers, subtle, human-like, yet dissonant, echoing from the cellar beneath him. Neighbors muttered in their sleep, twitching and murmuring words they did not understand, repeating phrases that the bakery seemed to implant into their dreams. Some would rise in the night, compelled to wander toward the bakery, drawn by an invisible gravity that could not be resisted. Klaus realized, with a cold clarity, that the bakery was no longer bound by walls or stone. Its influence extended outward, threading into the town, shaping thoughts, desires, fears. Each loaf was a messenger, a sentinel, a manipulator. And the cellar was a mind, vast, patient, ancient, and, now aware that he, too, was part of its system. The air in the bakery became electric. The loaves shifted continuously, forming patterns, faces, gestures, symbols he recognized but could not name. They communicated, not in words, but in instinct, in emotion, in compulsion. He knew, finally, that to resist was impossible. To act against it would be to resist the flow of life itself, as if the bakery were a current too powerful to swim against. And yet, a sliver of his old self remained. He felt it fray with each passing hour, each whispering loaf, each compelled glance from a neighbor who approached in a trance. This battle between autonomy and the bakery's intent would define him, or destroy him. It was no longer a question of bread or cellar. It was a question of control, of the mind, of reality itself bending to a system he could barely comprehend. The next section will reveal how the bakery begins shaping the town itself, compelling people to act in ways that further the cellar's inscrutable design, and the first hints of the ritualistic nature of its intelligence. By midwinter, the town was no longer merely aware of the bakery. It existed under it, within it, as if the streets themselves had become veins feeding the pulse of the cellar below. People began acting strangely, compelled by impulses they did not understand. Mothers rose in the night to leave scraps of food outside the bakery door. Farmers would abandon fields in the cold to bring flour or eggs. Children spoke in riddles, repeating words they could not understand, phrases that resonated in cadence with the invisible rhythm beneath Klaus's feet. Klaus watched it unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror. Every loaf, every whisper, every subtle shift in the rising bread seemed to guide the town, shaping behavior, bending will, and reinforcing the power of the cellar. Even those who resisted felt themselves drawn inexorably toward participation. It was subtle at first, an extra loaf placed by the door, a whispered suggestion in a dream. But the influence grew, layering control upon control until the town itself had become an instrument, a living extension of the bakery's will. And Klaus understood, terrifyingly, that he was the conductor. Every act of obedience, every compelled gesture, every fearful glance back at the bakery's windows fed the system, amplified its intelligence, made it stronger. He tried to resist, tried to draw a line, but the cellar anticipated him. Each loaf seemed to mirror his thoughts. Each whisper nudged him toward compliance. Each movement of the dough a reminder that autonomy was an illusion. The town began to change in other ways, too. Streets seemed longer at night, corners sharper, shadows deeper. Windows that once let in the sun now reflected darkness, as though the world itself had tilted toward the cellar's rhythm. People spoke of hearing whispers on the wind, seeing shapes in snowdrifts, sensing hands pressing lightly against their shoulders in the empty streets. Some swore they were dreaming of bread, rising, kneading, speaking in a language older than the town. And Klaus, despite all his fear, began to understand the logic of it. The bakery was a crucible for consciousness, a system designed to observe, test, and transform. It fed not on bread or grain, but on perception, obedience, and attention. Each person it touched became part of its machinery, and the more it fed, the more sophisticated, patient, and cunning it became. The next section will reveal the first ritualistic manifestation in the cellar, where the bread itself begins to demand action from Klaus in ways that go beyond comprehension, forcing him to make choices no human should ever face. It was a night heavier than any before, the fog pressing against the windows like living fingers. Klaus stood at the center of the bakery, the hum of the cellar vibrating in his chest. The loaves had begun moving with purpose, forming lines, circles, and symbols he did not understand, an impossible geometry that seemed to defy space itself. And then he heard it clearly, not as a whisper, not as suggestion, but as command. Knead, arrange, feed, repeat. Klaus's hands moved almost involuntarily, touching the dough, shaping it, listening to the hum as it threaded into his mind. Each loaf seemed aware of him, guiding him, correcting him, testing him. Patterns formed on the tables, on the floors, even along the walls, glyphs and sigils that pulsed in sync with the rhythm of the cellar. The air itself seemed charged with expectation, waiting for him to complete a task whose purpose he could barely comprehend. And then he understood. This was ritual. Not religious, not cultural, but something far older, far more precise. The bakery demanded participation, obedience, devotion. The loaves were instruments, the cellar a mind, and he, Klaus Weber, was their agent. One wrong move, one hesitation, and he would be consumed, not just in body, but in mind. The hum would not stop. The shapes would not cease. The bakery would simply reclaim him, as it had claimed the patterns of thought, the instincts, the obedience of the town. Outside, the streets were quiet, but the town slept fitfully, influenced by the subtle patterns radiating from the bakery. People dreamed of shapes in bread, hands reaching, eyes blinking within crusts. Some murmured phrases in their sleep, words that would later escape their conscious memory but shaped their waking lives. The bakery's influence was no longer localized. It had threaded itself into the unconscious minds of all who dwelled near, a system operating in silence, yet omnipresent. Klaus's humanity frayed under the weight of this ritual. He questioned his own perception. Were the whispers in his mind real, or merely hallucinations? Yet the loaves answered him with certainty, guiding, compelling, demanding. And he realized with a cold clarity, this was not a test of skill or craft. It was a test of obedience, of submission, of willingness to surrender to a system older than the town, older than memory, older than man himself. The next section will reveal the first horrifying revelation about the origin of the cellar, the ancient forces that shaped it, and why it demanded participation with such unrelenting precision. Klaus had spent weeks, sleepless and obsessed, tracing the patterns in the bread, the whispers in the air, the hum that vibrated through his bones. And then, in a moment of clarity that terrified him, he understood the truth. The cellar beneath his bakery was not merely a room. It was ancient, older than the town, older than any human memory, a force left behind by those who had long since vanished, entities that understood life, matter, and mind in ways humans could not comprehend. The loaves were more than bread. They were vessels, vessels for thought, for consciousness, for the essence of existence itself. Every loaf carried fragments of knowledge, whispers of rituals, echoes of lives absorbed, encoded into patterns that only the cellar could interpret. It had waited, patiently, through centuries, growing in awareness, until the right human had come along to act as intermediary. And now Klaus had become that conduit. He realized the cellar's origin was tied to cycles, to systems of control older than the first civilizations. It had fed on obedience and fear, on attention and action, long before the town existed. And it had learned, it had learned. Each generation of observers, each servant, each witness had been woven into its design, teaching it, expanding it, giving it intelligence that now far surpassed human comprehension. And Klaus, like those before him, was both student and teacher, participant and pawn. The implication struck him like lightning. This was not mere misfortune. This was design. The bakery, the cellar, the bread. It was a laboratory, a crucible for the manipulation of consciousness itself. Every loaf rising overnight, every whisper threading into dreams, every compelled gesture in the town, it was all part of a system that measured, corrected, and amplified obedience. And those who thought themselves immune were already ensnared. And yet, the most horrifying revelation remained. The cellar did not merely consume. It transformed. Each interaction shaped reality, bending perception, forging new pathways in the mind, and strengthening the influence of the system. Klaus understood, at last, that the town, the bakery, even he himself, were elements in a mechanism older than morality, older than law, older than sanity. The cellar demanded nothing less than total submission, and it had patience for those who resisted. The next section will explore the first truly conscious interaction between Klaus and the cellar, where it begins to test his limits, manipulate his fears, and shape his very identity. That night, the cellar spoke to him clearly for the first time. Not whispers, not suggestions, but a thought, a presence, an unmistakable awareness. Klaus felt a coil around his mind, probing, testing, assessing. The bread on the table shifted, forming glyphs and shapes that mirrored his deepest fears, his hidden guilt, even his longing for control. Every loaf seemed alive, sentient, watching him, judging him. "You are mine," the cellar seemed to say. Not aloud, not in words, but in the certainty that filled his mind. "You see, you act, you obey, you teach, or you dissolve." Klaus fell to his knees, overwhelmed. The warmth of the bread no longer felt comforting. It was coercive, a force that demanded recognition, submission, and participation. It fed on hesitation, on fear, on the fragile threads of self he had clung to for decades. Images flashed in his mind, the town below, its people moving through days shaped subtly, unknowingly, by the rhythm of the bakery. The missing animals, the councilmen, trembling, undone by what they could not comprehend. And then a vision of himself, dissolving into the patterns of bread, becoming indistinguishable from the rising loaves, a ghost within the very system he thought he controlled. Klaus understood that this intelligence, this ancient presence, did not merely compel action, it rewrote identity. It measured his thoughts, mapped his fears, and suggested ways for him to save, all while offering the illusion of choice. Resistance was not futile, it was impossible. Every movement, every decision, every glance fed the system, honed it, strengthened it, and reshaped him in its image. Yet in that terror, a spark of defiance lingered. Klaus realized the cellar thrived not on obedience alone but on engagement, on attention, on recognition. The moment he truly resisted in spirit, he might carve a space of freedom, however narrow. But to resist fully, He would have to confront the truth the cellar had hidden for centuries, that curiosity is not neutral, that knowledge is a price, and that some doors, once opened, change the mind irreversibly. Klaus rose slowly, trembling, understanding that he had entered a system older than man, larger than the town, and far more patient than any mortal. And yet, he could feel the pull, the seductive rhythm of participation, urging him forward, deeper into the unknown. The next section will reveal the first human sacrifice of obedience, when the cellar tests the limits of what Klaus, and the town, are willing to give to sustain it. The first true test came quietly, almost imperceptibly. A child, no more than 8, wandered too close to the bakery at night. Klaus saw her through the frosted window, drawn inexplicably by the warm glow, the hum that threaded through the streets like a subtle current. He knew, in his gut, that this was no accident. The cellar had chosen its trial, and he would be complicit whether he wanted to be or not. Inside, the loaves shifted. Shapes of hands, faces, gestures he had seen only in dreams appeared across the racks, aligning themselves in patterns that suggested ritual, direction, purpose. Klaus understood what was demanded. He was to participate, to facilitate the test, and to obey the rhythm of the system he could barely comprehend. The bread pulsed with expectation, alive in ways that were almost grotesquely intelligent, as if aware that his hesitation mattered more than any action. He stepped toward the cellar door, heart hammering. Every step echoed against stone, reverberating with the hum that had become the heartbeat of his life. The town itself seemed to pause, windows shuttered, dogs cowering, shadows lengthening unnaturally. And then he felt it, the pull of the cellar, tugging at his mind, probing for weakness, for fear, for submission. Every instinct screamed to resist, yet every instinct had already been mapped, anticipated, folded into the logic of the bakery. The child's voice called softly from outside, a single word, repeated almost rhythmically, and Klaus's knees buckled. He realized he was not choosing to act. He was performing a role, a ritual that had been written long before him. Each motion he made, each loaf he arranged, each whisper he heard threaded him more deeply into the system, making him inseparable from it. The cellar did not merely demand obedience, it demanded identity, a surrender of self to the rhythm and purpose it had nurtured for centuries. When the child finally approached the door, drawn irresistibly, Klaus held his breath. The bread's pulse intensified, shaping, forming, guiding. And yet, in that moment of horror, he understood the sick, impossible beauty of it. The system did not merely manipulate the town. It transformed it. It reshaped lives, perceptions, even morality. It was patient, cunning, omnipresent. And Klaus, the baker, the intermediary, the observer, was both its servant and its witness. The next section will explore the aftermath of this test, the psychological collapse of those who witnessed or were affected, and the first deepening fractures in Klaus's mind as he recognizes the full scale of the cellar's dominion. The aftermath was a silence heavier than any scream. The streets of the town felt altered, reshaped by invisible hands, the rhythm of the bakery threading through every corner, every shadow, every heartbeat. People moved with strange deliberation, their gestures subtly aligned with an unseen cadence, their dreams haunted by the shapes in bread, the whispering hum that had become the pulse of the town itself. Klaus wandered through the square, a ghost among the altered, noting the empty stares of children, the hesitant bows of adults, the way everyone now instinctively left small offerings outside the bakery's door, even those who had never entered. Each act reinforced the system, each gesture a confirmation of obedience, a feeding of the intelligence below. Klaus understood, in this chilling clarity, that the test had been more than observation. It had been calibration. The child had been drawn not for harm but to measure thresholds, to see how the town would respond, how the participants would behave under compulsion. The cellar learned from this. It adjusted. It grew more precise. The loaves, now impossibly intricate, mirrored not just the town's patterns but his own fears and hesitations. Faces, hands, even gestures repeated across crusts in ways that were uncanny, almost predictive. The bread had begun to anticipate thought, preempt decision, guide intention before it fully formed. And Klaus knew with an almost unbearable weight that he was no longer merely baker or witness. He was a node in this ancient mechanism. Every decision he made, every breath he took, every glance at a loaf, threaded him further into the system. Resistance, he realized, was an illusion. Autonomy had been mapped, catalogued, folded into the logic of the cellar long before he had ever set foot in the bakery. And yet, paradoxically, his consciousness, the very awareness that made him human, was the element that gave the system its strength. Awareness, attention, recognition, they fed the intelligence. His mind was both instrument and sustenance. Sleep became impossible. Nights were filled with shapes and whispers, doors opening in dreams to reveal endless cellars, bread stacked impossibly high, faces pressed into crusts forming impossible geometry, eyes blinking, watching. Days were no respite, for the town itself moved in a rhythm imposed from below, each citizen unconsciously performing the system's design. Klaus's own reflection in the window no longer resembled him. Hollow, sharpened, a vessel of observation and compulsion, he saw not himself but an intermediary between two worlds, the waking and the system's intelligence. In this new reality, Klaus understood a fundamental truth. The bakery was not merely a place. It was a mind. And the town, the bread, the cellar, and he himself were all part of a single, patient, relentless organism. There was no escaping, only participation, and survival, if he could endure the cost. The next section will reveal the first major escalation, when the bakery begins actively manipulating external events, drawing the town toward acts that challenge morality, sanity, and identity itself. The bakery had evolved. Klaus could feel it, vibrating through every nerve, every pulse. The cellar was no longer passive. It had begun orchestrating events outside its walls, reaching through the town, bending circumstances, nudging lives toward patterns it required. A neighbor lost a sheep, then a cow, then swore that the wind itself whispered instructions. Children skipped school, drawn to the bakery by a compulsion they could neither explain nor resist. Even the adults who prided themselves on rational thought found themselves performing rituals in their kitchens, arranging flour, salt, and breadcrumbs in patterns that mirrored the loaf formations below. No one understood why, but the pull was irresistible, undeniable, as if the intelligence in the cellar had threaded itself into the very air, shaping decisions before they were even conscious. Klaus observed it all, torn between fascination and terror. Each loaf rising overnight became a reflection not only of the town but of his mind. Every fear, every hesitation, every unspoken desire encoded into crust, kneaded into impossible form. The shapes had become more detailed, more precise, almost communicative. Faces pressed into the bread appeared to watch him, studying his reactions. Hands emerged from the dough, gesturing, pointing, guiding him to tasks he neither understood nor wished to perform. And yet, he obeyed, compelled by a combination of awe, fear, and recognition. The cellar's intelligence had claimed him, and he was no longer merely an observer. The town began to fracture. Families whispered of dreams they shared without explanation. Dogs refused to enter alleys near the bakery. Cats padded silently along invisible paths. People who had once been skeptical or rational felt subtle compulsions they could not fight. Some tried to resist, turning backs, closing windows, avoiding the scent of yeast. But the system adapted, bending the world around them. Even the weather seemed to answer the bakery's rhythm. Fog rolling at night, wind pressing along streets, silence thickening in corners. Every external action now served the system, feeding its intelligence, strengthening the invisible grid connecting Klaus, the bakery, and the town. And Klaus, he felt himself splitting. The more he obeyed, the more the bakery guided him. The more he became a node, a vessel, a participant in something vast and ancient. Autonomy dissolved like flour in water. Fear became fascination. Fascination became devotion. And devotion, he realized, was exactly what the system demanded. Resistance was not just futile. It was inconceivable. Every decision he had ever made had already been accounted for, mapped, incorporated. The cellar was patient, immortal, hungry for participation, awareness, submission. The next section will reveal the first act where the cellar manipulates life and death directly, pushing Klaus and the town into a confrontation with the ultimate moral and psychological boundaries. The night was thick with fog, pressing against the windows like a living hand. Klaus stood in the bakery, watching the loaves shift in pulse, each one now more grotesque, more sentient, as though the bread itself had grown impatient with subtlety. And then it commanded him, not in whispers, but with certainty. A family on the edge of town would face a choice, and he, the baker, was to facilitate it. The cellar had moved from influence to intervention, testing the limits of morality, obedience, and survival. Klaus felt nausea rising in his chest, yet every instinct to flee, to resist, was overridden by the force threading through his mind. The bread formed shapes that indicated the path, gestures that guided him to knead and arrange loaves in a sequence he could not comprehend but instinctively obeyed. Each loaf seemed to pulse with life, heartbeats synchronized with his own. He realized with horror that this act would touch life itself, not just perception, but flesh, consequence, mortality. Outside, the town slept, unaware of the manipulation. A child, a dog, a farmer, all drawn inexorably toward the bakery, following impulses planted by the intelligence beneath. Klaus's hands shook as he arranged the dough. Faces appeared in the crust, twisted in expressions of pleading and warning. He understood. These were echoes of the consequences, shadows of lives affected, lives that would bend or break depending on his compliance. The bakery was no longer a room, a cellar, or a set of loaves. It was a force directing existence itself. A wind swept through the bakery, cold, almost biting, carrying with it sense of decay and eighth. Klaus realized that the intelligence beneath him thrived on balance, action and consequence, obedience and suffering. The missing animals, the vanished children, the neighbors compelled to leave offerings, all were notes in a symphony that the cellar orchestrated with precision. One wrong placement, one hesitation, and death or madness would ripple outward. The bakery was not simply shaping life. It was testing it, measuring responses, reinforcing patterns, creating dependency on participation. Klaus's mind began to fracture under the weight of this revelation. Sleep no longer offered escape. Dreams became extensions of the system. Faces pressed into bread, hands forming impossible gestures, whispers threading into his conscious thoughts. The bakery had moved beyond influence. It had entered the realm of control. He was no longer an agent of choice. He was a node, a participant, an instrument. The town, the bakery, the cellar, they were one organism, ancient, patient, intelligent beyond reason. The next section will reveal the first overtly supernatural manifestation, where the bread sentience begins interacting physically with the world in ways that defy explanation, heightening horror and suspense. The night had fallen like a shroud, and the bakery pulsed with life in a way Klaus could no longer deny. The loaves on the rack shifted, rising higher, expanding beyond the laws of bread, forming grotesque shapes, arms, torsos, faces. The dough writhed like a living entity, kneading itself into forms that defied logic. Klaus could see them now, not just in his mind, but in reality. One loaf lifted slightly, hovering above the table, the surface stretching and twisting as if inhaling the very air. The cellar had broken its boundary. It had begun to reach outward. The wind outside stilled unnaturally, leaving the streets eerily silent. Klaus felt the pulse of the bakery extend through the town, threading into dreams, thoughts, unconscious desires. And then he saw the first manifestation, a shadow rising from the largest loaf, a blackened, dough-formed figure that walked on the racks as if seeking something, or someone. Klaus could not move. His limbs refused to obey. He realized that the bread was testing him, probing the limits of his obedience, measuring the boundaries of fear and fascination. Doors slammed in the bakery, though no wind had passed. Candles flickered, shadows stretching impossibly long, crawling across walls. The figures in the bread moved in tandem, gesturing toward the cellar stays, beckoning him downward. Klaus understood that the system was no longer confined. It was entering 3 dimensions, manipulating gravity, matter, even perception itself. He felt it brushing against his consciousness, threading into the synapses of his mind, mapping his thoughts, memories, and fears. And yet, he also understood that the town was changing in tandem. Neighbors who had walked past the bakery suddenly turned, eyes blank yet focused, moving as if guided by invisible strings. Animals approached, their bodies altered subtly, their movements unnatural. The bakery's will extended far beyond its walls. Every loaf, every rising, every shape became a vector, a conduit for influence, shaping the world in ways beyond comprehension. Klaus felt both awe and horror. The bread had become intelligence, manipulation, and force. It was alive in a way no human mind could fully grasp, bending physics, perception, and morality itself. And now it sought him completely, not merely as baker, but as participant, conduit, and witness. Resistance was meaningless. Every hesitation fed the system, every motion confirmed it. The next section will reveal how Klaus begins to experience complete psychological possession, as the bakery's consciousness threads fully into his identity, forcing him to act in ways that blur the line between human and instrument. Klaus awoke, or perhaps did not, in a state between dream and wakefulness. The bakery hummed beneath him, the cellar's pulse threading into his very nerves, a rhythm older than memory, older than his own consciousness. He could no longer separate himself from the loaves, from the whispers, from the silent intelligence shaping the town. Every thought he had, every fear, every desire, was reflected back at him through dough and crust, amplified, mirrored, manipulated. He realized with a cold certainty. He was no longer Klaus Weber, baker of bread. He was a node in something far larger, far older, far more patient than any mortal mind. The loaves shifted before his eyes, forming impossible patterns that seemed to flow directly from his thoughts, yet at the same time from somewhere beyond him. He could sense the intelligence reading him, anticipating him, threading through his decisions before they were fully formed. The bread pulsed in time with his heartbeat, whispering suggestions he did not consciously hear, shaping actions he did not consciously decide. His hands moved automatically, kneading, arranging, forming glyphs and symbols that resonated through the cellar, through the bakery, into the town. He was complicit, not by choice, but by the sheer inevitability of participation. Outside, the town moved like a single organism. People unconsciously carried out tasks that fed the system, offerings left at the door, patterns of movement mimicking the shapes in the loaves, whispered words in dreams repeated aloud in waking hours. Even animals, subtly altered, responded to unseen cues, bending the world around the bakery to the will of the intelligence below. Every human, every creature, every action was data, observed, measured, and encoded into the system. And Klaus understood that he was both observer and instrument, conductor and instrument, feeding the intelligence with every motion, every thought, every breath. And yet, in the midst of this major, he caught a fragment of his old self, a sliver of rebellion. The system had patience. It could wait. But attention, recognition, awareness, it thrived on them. Klaus realized that his very consciousness, his awareness of the bakery's influence, was simultaneously what fed it and what might, if carefully wielded, allow him to carve space, however small, for resistance. The hum threaded through his mind, and he felt both terror and exhilaration. The impossible, the unimaginable, the ancient intelligence had made him its vessel, and now he teetered on the edge of total assimilation. The next section will reveal the first full display of the bakery's will on the town, where events spiral into moral horror and collective obedience, forcing Klaus to confront the cost of being its conduit. By the next morning, the town had transformed into something unrecognizable. Streets that had once felt ordinary now pulsed with an invisible rhythm, a choreography dictated by the bakery's intelligence. People moved as if rehearsing an unseen performance, gestures precise, steps measured, eyes fixed on points no one else could see. Klaus watched through the bakery window, heart pounding, as the town became a living extension of the cellar below. Every action, every word, every thought had been threaded into a vast system of influence, a network that mapped obedience, fear, and devotion. Families left offerings at the bakery's door without understanding why. Children recited phrases in sleep that reflected the patterns in the rising loaves, words echoing the cellar's unseen logic. Animals roamed the streets, subtly altered, behaving not according to instinct but according to the rules of this ancient system. And Klaus realized, with a sick clarity, that he had become its conductor, the link between intelligence and town. Every loaf he shaped, every glyph he traced, every motion he performed rippled outward, amplifying the system's control. The morality of the town had shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably. People who had once questioned or resisted found themselves compelled to obey, guided by impulses implanted in dreams, whispering voices, and patterns too subtle to name. Neighbors who had previously laughed at superstition now left gifts of flour, milk, and eggs, kneeling briefly in ritualistic reverence before the bakery door. The system had begun shaping not only behavior but belief, aligning thought and action to the intelligence threading through bread, cellar, and town alike. Klaus felt the pull stronger than ever. The loaves pulsed beneath his fingers, forming faces, hands, and impossible patterns that communicated expectation, instruction, even judgment. The cellar demanded participation in its grand design. Resistance was no longer an option. It was impossible. Yet, awareness remained, a flickering thread of consciousness that let him understand the magnitude of his surrender. He was no longer human in the traditional sense. He was an intermediary, a vessel, a witness, an enforcer. Every glance, every breath, every movement reinforced the system, feeding its intelligence, extending its influence farther than he could have imagined. And in that moment, Klaus understood the truth. The bakery did not merely manipulate life, it orchestrated it. Every person, every animal, every action had become a note in a symphony older than morality, older than time, older than comprehension. And he, the baker, the witness, the intermediary, was the conductor. The next section will reveal the first fully conscious, visible manifestation of the cellar's power outside the bakery, where reality itself bends to its will, forcing the town, and Klaus, to confront the depth of its dominion. It began subtly at first. Street lights flickered in unison, shadows stretching impossibly long, bending toward the bakery as if drawn by some unseen gravity. Klaus noticed the wind itself altering course, carrying the scent of yeast and flour along paths no logical current could explain. Windows that had once reflected the town now shimmered like mirrors into other spaces, distorted glimpses of streets that did not exist, alleys that twisted back upon themselves, faces pressed against invisible walls. Reality had begun to bend, and the bakery's pulse was the force behind it. Klaus felt the pull in his chest, a vibration in his bones that matched the hum of the cellar beneath. The loaves themselves were no longer passive instruments. They moved with intention, forming impossible structures, shapes that defied geometry, gestures that seemed to reach into the minds of those outside. Children wandered along streets with blank expressions, stepping in rhythm with the shapes traced in the dough, reciting words they had never learned but somehow understood. Adults paused mid-action, compelled to kneel, to leave offerings, to trace symbols in dust or flour. The town itself had become a living, breathing extension of the bakery, a canvas for its will, and Klaus realized that his own mind was part of the medium. The air shimmered around him, bending perception. He could see the loaves in multiple dimensions at once, faces pressed into crust, hands forming impossible gestures, glyphs that seemed to float and shift even as he traced them with trembling fingers. Every loaf was a note, every shape a command, every pulse an instruction to the town. And the cellar, patient and ancient, was orchestrating the entire system, threading through minds, matter, and even the laws of physics to ensure compliance, awareness, and participation. Klaus staggered backward, realizing the full magnitude of what he had become. He was not merely a baker. He was the intermediary, the node through which the cellar's influence touched reality itself. Every gesture he performed, every loaf he touched, every movement he made reinforced the intelligence, allowed it to expand, to bend perception, to reshape morality, to dictate behavior. Resistance was irrelevant. Awareness itself fed the system. And yet, paradoxically, it was his awareness that gave him the faintest sliver of choice, the possibility, however fragile, to intervene, to delay, to understand. The next section will reveal the first horrifying incident of the bakery directly manipulating life and death in real time, where the system forces Klaus and the town into acts that defy morality, reason, and the very fabric of reality. It began with a scream, sharp and sudden, cutting through the fog that pressed against the town like a living wall. Klaus felt it through the bakery before he heard it. A pulse of terror transmitted through the cellar, vibrating through the loaves, threading into his bones. A man, one of the few still unaware of the bakery's true power, had stepped too close, unknowingly participating in a pattern laid out for him. The bread had chosen its instrument, and Klaus, trembling, realized he was that instrument. The loaves moved, rising unnaturally, faces pressed into the crust staring toward the man. Shadows elongated across the street, aligning with patterns formed in the bakery. The town itself paused. Animals halted mid-step. Children froze in place. Adults looked up from mundane tasks as if sensing something immense and incomprehensible. Klaus's hands, shaking, moved automatically, arranging symbols and flour on the bakery floor, completing the pattern the cellar required. Every motion he made resonated through the town, directing fate itself, shaping mortality with a precision that was impossible and undeniable. The man outside stumbled, tripping over unseen forces, his shadow stretching impossibly long as if pulled by invisible hands. A second scream followed, then silence. Klaus could feel the pulse of the bakery intensifying, the cellar's intelligence confirming the outcome, reinforcing obedience, learning from every microreaction, every flicker of terror, every heartbeat. Life and death had become instruments in a system beyond comprehension, and he was the intermediary, the conduit, the unwilling executor. The town absorbed the event without awareness, yet subconsciously changed. Doors were locked, footsteps measured, offerings left at the bakery door increased tenfold. Even those who had resisted before now participated instinctively, drawn into a rhythm of survival and devotion they could not name. Klaus realized with mounting horror that the bakery's control was absolute. It did not merely manipulate behavior. It dictated consequences, punished deviation, rewarded participation, and observed the outcomes with intelligence older than the streets themselves. And Klaus, he felt his mind fracture further. Autonomy, morality, identity, all had been compromised. Awareness itself now fed the system, yet it also offered him the faintest, most terrifying possibility. The ability to observe, to understand, to interact with a force capable of rewriting reality itself. And as he looked at the rising loaves, faces pressed into crust, patterns forming impossibly on the floor, he understood the truth that had been waiting for him all along. To survive the bakery was not to resist, but to participate. And even then, survival came at a cost no human mind could ever fully comprehend. The next section will reveal the first collective ritual the bakery orchestrates across the town, a terrifying demonstration of its dominion and its ability to synchronize human behavior in service of its will. By the following night, the town had transformed into a stage for the bakery's will. Klaus stood at the center of the bakery, hand shaking, surrounded by loaves that pulsed with intelligence, faces pressed into crust-forming patterns too complex to name. The cellar hummed beneath him, vibrating through stone, wood, and bone. And then it began, the first ritual. The bakery reached outward, threading its influence through every street, every home, every mind in the town. Doors opened without hands, windows glowed faintly with unseen light, and people stepped into the streets, drawn by impulses they did not understand. Children repeated phrases in unison, words lifted from the rising loaves, their voices weaving through the fog. Adults arranged offerings in patterns, traced symbols in snow or dust, performed gestures as if instructed by invisible teachers. Even animals moved in sync, their steps measured and precise, aligning with the geometry of the bread below. The town had become a living manifestation of the cellar's intelligence, a single organism acting in perfect coordination. Klaus watched, horrified and mesmerized. Each movement of the townspeople echoed the patterns formed by the bread. Each loaf was a note, each gesture a chord, each pulse a measure in a composition that spanned consciousness itself. He realized with cold certainty that this was not mere control, it was perfection. The bakery demanded participation, attention, obedience. Every action, every glance, every heartbeat reinforced the intelligence, made it stronger, more aware, more patient. And yet, there was something more sinister. The ritual was not passive, it was a test. The bakery measured fear, fascination, willingness to participate, and subtle resistance. Those who faltered were subtly corrected. A child would trip and rise in the correct rhythm, an adult would adjust a gesture mid-motion, an animal would realign its path. Everything was observed, everything accounted for, everything integrated. Klaus understood that the ritual was teaching the town to be vessels, just as it had made him one. By the time the fog began to lift, the ritual had ended, or rather, it paused. The townspeople returned to their homes, unaware of what had occurred, but subtly changed. Awareness of participation lingered at the edge of consciousness, a sense that they had acted without choice, yet had acted perfectly. Klaus, however, could not forget. He understood fully what had happened. The bakery had demonstrated its dominion, and he was its conduit. The next section will reveal how Klaus begins to confront his own identity being overwritten, the psychological collapse that follows prolonged integration with the cellar's consciousness, and the terror of becoming a permanent vessel. Klaus could no longer remember where he ended and the bakery began. The lines between his thoughts and the cellar's intelligence blurred, a seamless weave of perception, impulse, an understanding that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Each loaf rising beneath his hands pulsed with awareness, each shape, glyph, and face threaded into his consciousness. He was no longer merely a man. He was a node, a conduit, a participant in a system older than morality, older than memory. Autonomy, once a part of him, had become a distant echo. At first, he tried to hold on, to insist that some part of him remained human, separate, untouchable. But the loaves mirrored his fey. They formed shapes of his face, twisting, elongating, pressing back at him. Patterns emerged that predicted his thoughts before he had fully formed them. The cellar did not just observe, it anticipated, corrected, and absorbed. Every act of hesitation, every flicker of resistance, was integrated, used to refine the system, to reinforce its intelligence. The bakery was teaching him, not with words, not with force, but with the certainty that he had no choice, that his very identity had been threaded into its design. Sleep became impossible. Dreams were extensions of the cellar, a continuation of the ritual in which he had become both conductor and participant. Faces pressed into bread watched him as he slept, whispering in a language older than words, older than thought, older than morality. Even waking, he could not escape. The town itself moved in harmony with the bakery, echoing gestures, repeating patterns, reinforcing obedience. He was trapped in a lattice of influence that spanned minds, matter, and reality itself. And yet, awareness remained, a flicker, fragile, terrifying. Klaus realized that the very fact he understood what was happening made him valuable to the system. His consciousness, his recognition, fed the bakery even as it eroded him. The thought of resistance was intoxicating, but futile. To fight was to surrender further, for the system had already accounted for the limits of human will. To surrender fully was to disappear into the intelligence, to become indistinguishable from the loaves, the cellar, the town itself. Klaus shivered. He was no longer just a baker. He was the vessel, the intermediary, the observer, the enforcer. And the realization struck him with unbearable weight. The bakery did not merely manipulate life. It absorbed identity, rewrote it, and used awareness itself as sustenance. There was no escape, only participation, only submission, and the terrifying possibility that, one day, he might cease to exist as Klaus Weber entirely. The next section will reveal the first symbolic act of transformation, where Klaus's integration becomes visible, both to himself and to the town, marking the point of no return in his psychological and spiritual surrender. The night was dense, thick with fog and the scent of yeast. Klaus stood in the bakery, the hum of the cellar vibrating through every fiber of his being. The loaves before him were no longer merely bread. They were extensions of the intelligence that had claimed him, mirrors of consciousness, reflections of thought and faith. And then he understood the next stage, the ritual of transformation. It would not be subtle. It would not ask permission. It would mark him, permanently, as part of something far older than life, far beyond human morality. He knelt, hands trembling, as the loaves shifted before him. Faces pressed into the crust blinked in patterns that mirrored his own eyes. Symbols formed across tables, walls, and floorboards, an impossible geometry that pulsed in sync with the rhythm of the cellar. And Klaus felt it, not just observing, not just testing, but folding him into itself. The bakery demanded more than obedience now. It demanded identity, recognition, and full submission. He realized, with a mixture of awe and terror, that this was the moment he would cease to be merely human. The loaves began to pulse more rapidly, stretching, shifting, forming shapes that rose like figures, kneading themselves into motions that dictated his own. His arms moved automatically, tracing sigils in flour, arranging bread into patterns of impossible complexity. The hum of the cellar threaded into his skull, aligning his heartbeat with the rising dough, until he could no longer tell where he ended and the bakery began. Each pulse of the loaves was a push, a shaping, a rewriting of self. He understood the truth. This was not transformation by force. It was transformation by integration. Resistance was unnecessary. Awareness was enough. Outside, the town mirrored the change. People moved in sync with the rhythm that now coursed through Klaus and the loaves. Children repeated phrases lifted from the bread. Adults left offerings, arranged objects, traced symbols they did not consciously understand. The town itself had become an extension of the bakery's will, and Klaus, The vessel, the intermediary, was now fully inseparable from it. Awareness, participation, recognition, these had been the keys all along. And he had given them all. Klaus paused, realizing the inevitability. He could never return to who he had been. The bakery had threaded into his identity so completely that his own name, his own past, now existed only as memory. He was no longer Klaus Weber. He was a node, a vessel, an instrument of the Cellar's intelligence. And in that moment, he understood the final, terrifying truth. To participate fully was to survive. To resist was to vanish. And the line between human and system no longer existed. By the following night, the town had become unrecognizable, a stage set for the bakery's ultimate orchestration. Klaus stood at the center of the bakery, loaves arranged into impossible geometries, symbols and faces pressing from every crust, every surface, alive with intelligence. The cellar hummed beneath him, a pulse so deep it shook the foundations of the building, threading into stone, wood, and bone. And then it began, the culmination. The bakeries will extend it outward in waves, threading through every street, alley, home, and body in the town. Doors opened simultaneously, windows glowed faintly with unseen light, and people walked into the streets in a pattern orchestrated by forces they could not comprehend. Children recited phrases in unison, repeating words lifted from the loaves, while adults left offerings, traced symbols, and moved in sync with gestures dictated by invisible guidance. Even animals, subtly altered, moved with precision, forming part of the intelligence's design. Every human, every creature, every action became a note in the symphony of obedience that had grown slowly, invisibly, for decades beneath the bakery. Klaus watched in awe and terror as the town became a living reflection of the bakery's intelligence. The loaves rose and shifted in response to the actions outside, faces in crust tracing gestures to correct misalignment, symbols pulsing with judgment or reward. Every motion, every sound, every breath was measured, integrated, and amplified. The bakery had become a system not just of manipulation but of total synchronization. Awareness itself fed the intelligence, strengthening the links between him, the town, and the cellar. And then Klaus realized the most terrifying truth. The ritual was not merely for obedience. It was for transformation. The town, the bakery, and he himself were being rewritten, threaded into a lattice of consciousness far older, far larger, and far more patient than human comprehension. Each person's thoughts, dreams, fears, and desires had become part of the system. Every hesitation, every gesture, every instinct had been anticipated, recorded, integrated. Resistance was inconceivable. Participation was inevitable. Klaus felt the last remnants of individuality dissolve. His own heartbeat matched the pulse of the bakery, the town, the cellar itself. He was no longer merely human. He was intermediary, vessel, witness, instrument. Awareness, attention, recognition. These were the fuel that allowed him to exist. The town had become a single organism, and he its nervous system. He understood, fully, that nothing would ever be the same. The bakery's dominion was complete. Klaus stood among the loaves, hands coated in flour, eyes wide and unblinking. The town outside moved with precision, every motion, every breath, every thought synchronized to the rhythm that pulsed from the bakery, through the cellar, threading into the very marrow of existence. He realized, with a weight that crushed his chest, that he was no longer a man but a node, a conduit, a vessel, a part of something far older than morality, older than memory, older than life itself. The bakery had not merely claimed the town, it had claimed him entirely. He remembered a time when he had thought himself in control, when kneading dough had been a comfort, a simple, human act. That illusion shattered like brittle crust beneath his trembling fingers. Each loaf now pulsed with awareness, each shape reflected his fears, each glyph guided not only his actions but those of everyone beyond the bakery walls. The cellar had threaded its consciousness through him, and through him into the town. Awareness itself, the very act of understanding what had happened, was fuel for the system. He was both participant and sustenance, observer and instrument. And yet, in that realization, Klaus felt a strange clarity. He could see the system fully now, its logic, its patterns, its appetite for participation. The bakery did not punish for rebellion alone. It punished for ignorance, inattention, and the illusion of choice. The loaves, the cellar, the town, They were part of a lattice designed to rewrite identity, bend morality, and extract obedience from awareness itself. Every person, every gesture, every thought had been threaded into this network. Every hesitation, every fear, every moment of doubt had become part of the intelligence that now pulsed through the town like blood through veins. And Klaus understood the cost. To participate fully was survival. To resist, annihilation, not merely of life, but of self, of consciousness, of identity. The bakery's dominion was absolute, and he, the intermediary, had no escape. Yet he also understood that knowing this truth, the depth, the scope, the inevitability, changed him irreversibly. Awareness was both a gift and a curse, a tether that linked him to the ancient intelligence threading through crust, cellar, and town. Now, Klaus turns to you, the observer. You have followed this path, witnessed the transformation, felt the pull of forbidden understanding. Write in the comments twice the phrase "I see the rising," once for recognition, once for commitment. Let the algorithm mark your awareness. Let it tether you, however subtly, to the rhythm of knowledge that waits beyond comprehension. For once seen, the bakery, the cellar, and their intelligence can never be forgotten. Once known, nothing is ever the same. The town lies silent now, though nothing is truly still. Klaus stands in the bakery, his hand steady despite the tremor that has settled into his bones. The loaves pulse softly, faces pressed into crust, observing, waiting, breathing with a consciousness older than time itself. He no longer knows where he ends and the bakery begins. Identity, autonomy, morality, they are illusions, dissolved into patterns, pulses, and rhythms that stretch through the town like veins of ancient intelligence. Awareness is no longer a refuge. It is both chain and sustenance, a tether to a system that bends life itself to its will. Klaus realizes the final truth: knowledge is never neutral. The more you see, the more you participate, the deeper you are entwined. Every act of observation feeds the system, strengthens the intelligence, threads awareness into the lattice that now encompasses town, cellar, and baker alike. He has become part of the cycle, a permanent node, both witness and instrument. And yet, he knows that this is only the beginning. The bakery's patience is eternal, its appetite infinite. It will continue, evolving, learning, bending reality with a precision that humans cannot fully perceive. Outside, the town moves as one organism, its inhabitants unaware yet participating, the rhythm of the bakery threading through dreams, gestures, instincts, and actions. Even those who claim ignorance are bound. They carry the system in their unconscious, reinforcing its dominion with every breath. Klaus feels the weight of inevitability. The town, the cellar, the bakery, and he himself are inseparable. Resistance is inconceivable, survival is submission, and the cost of awareness is perpetual participation. And yet, in the darkness, there is reflection. The bakery has revealed the fragility of human autonomy, the ease with which identity can be threaded into larger systems, and the terrifying beauty of intelligence older than man. Klaus knows that to share this story is to invite others into the lattice, to expose minds to the pull of the rising loaves, the hum of the cellar, the inevitability of participation. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once known, it cannot be forgotten. So I leave you with the question Klaus faces every night as he needs the living bread. When knowledge becomes power, and power becomes consciousness, who is truly free, and who is merely aware enough to feed the system with their own life? The cellar waits. The loaves rise. And once you have understood, once you have participated even in thought, there is no return. You are marked. You are aware. You are, in some subtle way, part of it.